fact it does quite the opposite.
Mr Speaker.
Holly Walker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Last night, this House took a significant step towards ending discrimination and eliminating a serious inequality in our law. And that, of course, was passing the second reading of the Definition of Marriage Amendment Bill. And many of those who supported that bill, including many government members, talked about the message it would send to young people about their importance, their value, their human rights, and their mental and emotional well-being to remove that discrimination. It was a great moment in this House, Mr Speaker, and it made me very proud to be a member of it. But, Mr Speaker, in that context, it's particularly distressing that the very next day, after sending such a positive and affirming message to young people about their value and their future, we're undermining this message with this discriminatory and damaging bill that sends exactly the opposite message to young New Zealanders. Mr Speaker, what this bill says to young New Zealanders is that they are not worth as much as older New Zealanders, that their work and their labour, even if employed doing exactly the same job as an older counterpart, or managing them, that's right, is not as valuable as that older person's labour, that their needs, that their expenses, that their rent, food and living costs are not as important as those of older workers, that their rights, Mr Speaker, are not as important as those of older workers. So, Mr Speaker, it's no wonder that young people are disengaging from politics and Parliament and voting in droves when this House passes legislation like this, which disempowers and discriminates against them en masse. And just when we might have convinced some of them of our relevance and our value and our commitment to them and their future with the Marriage Equality Bill last night, and if you looked around the gallery here last night, Mr Speaker, it was young people that you saw. Just at that point, we slam them with this bill and undermine all of that good work. Because, Mr Speaker, the discrimination inherent in this bill is not acceptable. In just the same way that it's no longer acceptable to pay women less than men for doing exactly the same job, although arguably that does still take place in some cases, and just as it's unacceptable to pay workers of one ethnicity less than workers of another ethnicity. And when these things occur and they come to light, Mr Speaker, we are rightly outraged and we prosecute offending employers and we shake our heads and we tut-tut and we talk about discrimination. And yet here we have a government that is prepared to introduce comparable discrimination against young people into our employment law. Mr Speaker, on the basis of human rights and discrimination alone, this bill should be dead in the water. But as this government has demonstrated with a number of other pieces of legislation, like the current welfare changes, which impinge on the right of women, young people and children, rights-based arguments don't have a lot of impact on this government. So let's have a look at their own economic rationale for this bill and see how it stacks up. Mr Speaker, this government says that this bill will support young people entering the workforce and encourage employers to take on young workers. What a joke, combined with their other discriminatory policy against young workers of 90-day trial periods. At most, young people can expect to be hired at below subsistence wages for 3 months and then flicked on in favour of another new, cheap young worker. I wasn't on the Select Committee, Mr Speaker, but I've heard that it heard no evidence that introducing youth rates would decrease youth unemployment. In fact, there was conflicting evidence from government departments and economists on exactly that point. And even 2 submissions from employers didn't think the bill would actually help with youth unemployment. What the bill will do is incentivise employers to keep wages low, to keep New Zealand a low-wage economy, and continue to encourage the 50,000 plus New Zealanders every year who leave permanently for better wages and opportunities overseas. If this government really cared about youth unemployment, they could invest in skills training and apprenticeships more than they have. They could improve access to student support. They could support the manufacturing sector. And they could look at what's working in places like Aotearoa with the Mayor's Task Force. But they haven't done that, Mr Speaker. This bill doesn't make economic sense, it won't help youth employment, it's discriminatory and it sends a terrible message to young people about the value that this Parliament places on them, and I'm ashamed of this House for passing it.
Dr. Cam Calder.
My dad died when I was 6 years old. I was brought up by my